So as you can see, this is a very diverse panel. We have a representative from the US State Department, a CEO of a mining company as well. Let me start with you, if I can, George Kayati. Can you tell us what role the US government is taking in advancing critical mineral partnerships on the African continent?
So at a very high level, we are kind of committed to increased supply of the minerals that are important for the energy transition. We are committed to a diversified supply chain for each one of those minerals. And we are committed to high environmental, social, and governance standards being implemented in the production. So what that means for the African continent is that we are supportive of, we're trying to step away from what used to be kind of an extractive model to one where we look to support value added in African countries. And I think the most kind of tangible kind of expression of this is a MOU that we signed together with the governments of Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
In December, right?
In December, during the Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, that was signed by our Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken. So it shows the high level of commitment to the idea. And this, it's focused on exploring essentially the building of additional pieces of the value chain between Zambia and the DRC. So that it's not just the extraction of cobalt and copper and potentially lithium, but that it is an exploration of potentially processing and eventually even manufacturing. What that means, it wasn't just an empty MOU, although we do sign a number of MOUs out there. This one today, actually in Lusaka, a workshop is being held by the State Department that's bringing together civil society elements, the private sector, and the governments of Zambia and the DRC and the United States to really kind of explore what it means to build that value addition in the continent. And that's kind of what comes out of that. I think will help guide our path forward with that.
And so what's happened since you signed that MOU in December, and what's the timeline, of this initiative?
Yeah, so since the MOU, well, this workshop is the first piece. And it's happening, again, today in Lusaka, and will be continued in Kinshasa, because we're essentially trying to do both. The most tangible piece that we're looking at now is something called an IVLP, which is an International Visitors Leadership Program, which will bring aspiring leaders, young, kind of ambitious folks from the DRC and Zambia to the United States to learn from some of the some industry contexts in the US. But after that, it really means looking at all the tools the US government has to support the project, whether it could be the US EXIM, it could be the Development Finance Corporation, it could be the US Trade and Development Agency, which can pay for feasibility studies. So that's what it will look like.
Okay, great. So let me come to you, Ms. Doherty, and tell us a little bit more about the electric vehicle and battery market in DRC and Zambia specifically.
So thank you very much. Afreximbank and UNECA in 2021 joined other partner DFIs on the continent to support the government of DRC to host the DRC Africa Business Forum. And that forum was specifically to bring together key stakeholders on the continent to see how we can identify, how Africa can do more and play more within the value chain of the battery and electric vehicle. And following that summit, we got Bloomberg to do a study to even undertake what will it take if we want to have value addition on the continent in terms of processing our critical minerals and plugging into the battery and electric vehicle value chain. And the study discovered that it's very competitive to actually host battery and electric vehicle transformation and value addition facilities in DRC. In fact, DRC was 3 times more competitive than the US, China, and even Poland. And so following that forum, the president of DRC and his brother in Zambia decided to work together to develop electric vehicle and battery value chain in both countries. And of course, that led to a cooperation agreement between the 2 countries. One thing you should note here is that it's the African countries themselves now taking ownership and leadership. And of course, supported by Afrexim Bank, UNECA, Africa Development Bank, BADIA, the Africa Legal Sustainability Facility. And following that, they were able to agree to establish 2 special economic zones in DRC and Zambia that will be complementary, that will enable them harness their resources, the critical minerals in cobalt, in nickel, in magnesium, etc. And so, you know, that has been the journey so far. But where are we today, you may ask me? Right. I'm pleased to let you know that following that forum, a framework agreement was signed between DRC, Zambia, UNECA, and Afrexim Bank, providing both financial and technical assistance. And we also, Afrexim Bank, put together $1 million to support the preparation of feasibility study for the creation of these special economic zones in these 2 countries. And the special economic zone preparation, feasibility study preparation commenced in April this year. And I'm glad to invite all of you in this forum down to the deep dive room, where we'll be presenting to you the initial findings of this study to show you that we are moving, we are taking action, and it's not just words, it's not just agreements, it's actual implementation.
Absolutely. Antonio, Pedro, Ms. Doherty talked there about the importance of African countries taking leadership. What are your views on this, and how do we measure success when it comes to this market?
Thank you very much. So we are coming from the Nairobi Africa Climate Summit, to the Nairobi Declaration, that has indicated that Africa could become a powerhouse for climate solutions and investments. And yesterday, in the African Climate Summit, ambition, a couple of resource-rich countries, namely Namibia, Brazil, and Indonesia, have expressed what this means in practice. It's really about shared value creation. It's to ensure that our resources are utilized to promote resource-driven industrialization, create jobs, and enable our countries to go up in the value chain. The project that Olorante made reference to is really a path into that direction. And the opportunity represents about $7.7 trillion right. Between now and 2025, and $46 trillion by 2050, on the strength of the deployment of electric vehicles on the continent. And today, for example, we have here 2 ministers from DRC. DRC produces 70% of the global cobalt. Its GDP is about 55 or so billion dollars. Telsa's market valuation was $1.3 trillion in January 2021. And you cannot have Telsa without, of course, batteries. So it is really about addressing the paradox of plenty, in which, in one case, one country with 70% of the global cobalt with a GDP of 40%. If we were to enable DRC to just move one step up in the value chain towards the production of battery precursors, then it will move from a market which is about $11 billion mining to the battery precursor, which is $271 billion, 25 times more. If indeed, this is what our ambitions now, if you go up to the to the electric vehicle, then the sky is the limit. This is what this process is all about. And it's happening. It's happening now, as Olorante mentioned. In the deal room later today, we'll provide more details about that.
Right.
So it's about ensuring that Africa's resources are utilized to create value addition, to move the nature of the extractive industry, which are enclaves with absolutely no linkage to the local economy, to one where everyone benefits. You create opportunities for small and medium enterprises to be part of the value chain.
Right.
Through local content policies, through the utilization of national suppliers development programs, so that all of those benefit from this opportunity.
You mentioned the value chain there, and I'd like to come back to that and ask you about how you ensure that, reconcile that with a competitive environment, like when you can look at Brazil and Indonesia, for example. But let me come to you, Brian, and ask you about TechMed's perspective on this, and how do we ensure sustainability in the supply chains?
TechMed, we develop projects in the critical mineral supply chains around North America, South America, Europe, and Africa, and we've got a number of projects on the continent. The opportunities are clearly enormous. There are very significant and important critical mineral resources across Africa, but taking cobalt in the Congo aside for a minute, because that's a very specific case, in all cases, these resources are competing for capital to be developed with other resources and other alternatives elsewhere in the world. So on the one hand, Africa has a massive opportunity to be at the forefront of critical mineral supply for the energy transition, to the very considerable benefit of African development, African prosperity, African infrastructure and skills development, etc. On the other hand, and we have an opportunity as US-aligned investors and developers of mining and mineral processing assets to be part of that African story in partnership with African governments and African partners. But it's not going to happen of its own accord simply because the resources are there, and the beneficiation and added value that we all want to see being localized and adding as much value to communities and countries in which we invest as possible is likewise only going to happen in constructive partnership with African governments to enable the competitiveness of what we have to produce. So sure, as a part owned by the US government entity as TechMed is, we uphold very high standards from a sustainability and governance and transparency point of view and carbon footprint point of view, and we feel that's a crucial part of the story that we have to build together in partnership with African governments. And at the moment, it's not a big part of the story. The world is falling way, way behind in this epic supply-demand dislocation and severe structural short supply over the next 2, 4, 5, 10 years of these inputs into climate change mitigation, the EV ecosystem, renewable energy systems. And the supply chains remain dominated by China.
Right.
Who has made an enormous contribution to African investment and African development, but is less of a rigorous upholder of the standards that we would like to see dominate in our industry. And therefore, that dominant position has to be balanced. And we have to, in alignment with the US interests and the interests of US economic allies, seek partnerships in order to do that. And it's not just a matter of the new Cold War and geopolitical competition, of which this is a key front.
Right.
It's a matter of constructive, sustainable, responsible development, and recognition that the values underpinning responsible and sustainable development are values that are not always embodied by many of the dominant players in this space.
Right.
So I'm talking around the subject, but it's a very
But perhaps
important
George
theme.
can add to that, the dominant players, and Brian talked about China. Is that a concern for the US government right now as it engages with the DRC and Zambia on this initiative?
I mean, look, as I started, one of our main objectives here is diversifying global supply chains. Many of these supply chains go through one country. They are dominated by that country. And so just as, events like kind of the COVID-19 pandemic showed us, or the weaponization of energy has showed us in Europe, we don't want to be vulnerable to one country for the lifeblood of the energy transition. And so that's why we are looking to diversify these supply chains.